They laughed at the pregnant woman who tried to save the weakest cow on the ranch, until the day the rancher arrived. Comment below telling me what you thought of this story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and let me know what city you are watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story, and I want to get to know you better. So please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The cold that morning cut like crushed glass. Emily woke up before sunrise, as always, and as she placed her bare feet on the freezing floor of the hired hands room, she felt the baby move inside her belly. 7 months, 10 more weeks, and she would be a mother. All alone, but she would be a mother. She pulled her worn wool coat over the loose dress that still fit, tied her hair back in a tight ponytail, and headed out to the main house kitchen. The sun hadn't yet touched the horizon, and the frost covered the pasture like a white sheet gleaming under the waning moon. This was the kind of Montana winter that outsiders never expected, bone dry, freezing, capable of killing weak cattle overnight. Sarah was already in the kitchen when Emily walked in, getting the ranch hands' coffee ready. The two exchanged a minimal greeting. Emily grabbed the tin mug she used every day and poured the strong black coffee that Martha, the head cook, always had brewing since 4 in the morning. She drank it slowly, feeling the hot liquid go down and warm her stomach from the inside while the cold kept biting from the outside. It was 5:30 when she heard the heavy corral gates swinging open. Men's voices, the low lowing of cattle, the shuffling of boots on the hard dirt. Emily finished her coffee, rinsed her mug, and went to the side window of the kitchen, the one with a direct view of the main holding pen. The hands were sorting the herd. Carter, the foreman, was right in the center of the action. Tall, wearing a dark Stetson, barking orders in a deep voice that everyone obeyed without question. Tyler and Kyle worked the flanks, driving the animals with quick, efficient movements. Wyatt, the oldest of the bunch, hung back a bit, observing with that quiet way he had of getting the job done without making a fuss. And then Emily saw Bessie. The cow was huddled in the corner of the pen, separated from the rest, painfully thin, her ribs showing starkly under her dull hide. Her legs were trembling slightly. Her snout was low, almost touching the ground. Emily had known that animal for 3 weeks, ever since her first day at the ranch as a temporary day laborer, hired to help out during the busy handling season. She couldn't quite explain what she felt, but there was something about Bessie that touched her in a way that defied logic. Maybe it was the way the animal always lingered on the fringes of the herd. Maybe it was her eyes, which seemed to understand more than they should. Carter pointed at Bessie and said something Emily couldn't hear from inside. Tyler nodded. Kyle grabbed a rope. Wyatt didn't move a muscle. Emily felt her heart race. She dropped her mug in the sink, walked across the kitchen without a word to anyone, and went out the side door straight into the yard. The icy air slapped her face. She crossed the 60 feet separating the main house from the corral with quick strides, feeling her belly weigh heavy and the baby move again, as if feeling the urgency too. By the time she reached the corral gate, Carter was already instructing the hands to herd Bessie into the squeeze chute. "This one has given all she had to give," Carter was saying, his voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather forecast. "She's taking up space that could be turning a profit. Let's arrange for her disposal today." Emily pushed the heavy wooden gate and stepped into the corral. The movement made all the men stop dead in their tracks. Carter turned his head slowly, like someone who couldn't believe his own eyes. Tyler let out a short laugh, more out of surprise than amusement. Kyle furrowed his brow. Wyatt stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on her. Emily walked right to the center of the pen, placing herself between the men and the cow, and spread her arms wide. Her large belly was exposed under her unbuttoned coat. Her breath plumed white in the bitter morning cold. "No," she said. Her voice came out steady, steadier than she had expected. Carter blinked. Then he laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was worse. It was that low, almost incredulous chuckle of a man failing to process the absurdity of what he was seeing. "Come again?" Carter asked, taking a step forward. "I said no," Emily repeated. "This cow is not going to the slaughterhouse." Tyler laughed louder this time. Kyle whispered something to Mike, who had just walked up carrying a sack of feed. From the kitchen window, Sarah called Rachel and Shannon over to look. In a matter of seconds, the scene had spread through the main headquarters like a spark in dry hay. Carter took 2 more steps toward Emily. He stopped 3 feet away from her. His eyes were hard, the kind that never blinked when staring someone down. "You don't know the first thing about cattle, little lady. This cow is old. She's weak. She's no good to us anymore. That's just how the business works. Now step out of the pen before you get yourself hurt." "I'm not leaving," Emily said. "And she isn't too old. She's sick. And when something is sick, you treat it, you don't kill it." Carter stayed quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, but there was no warmth in it at all. "You're a day laborer, girl. You were hired to work up at the main house, not to give your 2 cents on the ranch's livestock. Now get out of there. I won't ask again." His tone had shifted. It was low, tightly controlled, carrying that harshness that didn't get clear the order was final. Emily felt the baby kick hard against her ribs. She looked at Carter, then back at Bessie, who stood trembling behind her in the freezing air, and finally glanced around at the men. None of them said a word. None of them moved. Their silence weighed just as much as Carter's threats. Slowly, she lowered her arms. She took a step to the side, then another. She walked out of the corral without looking back, bearing the heavy burden of every muffled laugh, every mocking stare, and every second of that silence that spoke louder than any insult. When she got back to the kitchen, Martha had her back turned, stirring a large pot on the stove. She didn't say a word. Sarah and Rachel kept quiet, too. Shannon glanced at Emily for a split second before looking away, like someone who had just witnessed something they wished they hadn't. Emily went straight to her room, shut the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and just stayed there, resting her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move, while desperately trying to steady her overly fast breathing. That night, when everyone was asleep and the ranch was submerged in the freezing silence of the dead of night, Emily woke up. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was as if her body knew what had to be done before her mind could even process it. She put on her coat, grabbed the small flashlight she kept in her drawer, and slipped out of the room without making a sound. The yard was deserted. The full moon illuminated the frost with a ghostly glow. Emily crossed the open space to the side shed where they stored the feed and filled a small bucket with a mix she had prepared herself earlier. Standard grain, mixed with herbs her grandmother had taught her to use when she was little. Alfalfa, lemongrass, crushed guava leaves, things that helped soothe a weak cow's digestion. She walked slowly to the corral, carrying the bucket in one hand and the flashlight in the other. The cold was so biting that her hands began to shake, and she had to stop twice just to blow on her fingers and get some feeling back. Bessie was lying down in the corner of the pen, all alone, shivering. When Emily approached, the cow lifted her head sluggishly, as if the movement cost every ounce of strength she had left. Emily set the bucket down and knelt beside the animal. The ground was like ice, and she felt the chill seep up through her legs. She stroked Bessie's neck gently, feeling the coarse hair and the warm skin beneath her palm. "You're going to get better," she whispered. "I won't let them hurt you." The cow rested her warm snout against Emily's arm. It was a simple gesture, but there was something about it that felt almost sacred in the freezing dead of night. Emily stayed there, kneeling on the icy dirt, feeding the animal small handfuls, blowing on her hands every now and then, feeling her baby move inside her, and thinking that maybe this was pure madness. But it didn't matter, because some things go beyond logic, and this was one of them. Emily woke up the next day with her entire body aching. Her back throbbed from the time spent kneeling on the cold ground, and her knees were bruised purple from pressing into the hard dirt of the corral. She stood up slowly, feeling every muscle complain, and went to the kitchen to start her routine. Martha was already there, as usual, but this time there was a different energy in the air. When Emily walked in, the head cook stopped stirring her pot and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts disapproval and poorly disguised worry. "You went down to the corral in the middle of the night," Martha said. It wasn't a question. Emily felt her stomach tie in knots. She didn't answer. She just grabbed her tin mug and poured her coffee. "Shannon saw you from the window," Martha pressed on, returning to her stirring with sharp, jagged motions. "Said you were out there with the old cow, that you brought her feed." "So what?" Emily drank her coffee without meeting her eyes. "So what is that Carter already knows? Tyler mentioned it at the ranch hand's breakfast. Everybody heard it. The silence that followed was suffocating." Emily finished her coffee, rinsed her mug, and left the kitchen without another word. As she walked down the hall toward the utility room, she heard Sarah and Rachel whispering to each other. The chattering stopped the second they spotted her. The day dragged on heavily. Emily did her chores around the main house, washing, ironing, making beds, setting the lunch table, but she could feel the stares burning into her, not direct looks, just those quick, darting glances from people trying not to get caught staring. Shannon walked past her twice without saying good morning. Sarah asked her to remake a bed that was already perfectly tucked. Rachel didn't meet her eyes once all morning long. At lunchtime, Emily ate by herself. The other staff members huddled on the far side of the dining hall, sitting closer together than usual, as if there were an invisible line drawn across the floor that she wasn't allowed to cross. No one said a single offensive word. No one needed to. The silent isolation was a sharper weapon than any insult. It was mid-afternoon when Carter called her over. She was folding bedsheets in the utility area when she heard his booming voice coming from the yard. Carter was standing by the equipment shed, arms crossed, with Tyler and Kyle flanking him. Wyatt was further back, fixing a fence, but Emily noticed he looked up the moment Carter called her name. "Emily, come here." She dropped the sheets and walked across the yard. The sun was high, but the wind was still razor sharp. She stopped about 6 feet away from Carter, her hands folded protectively over her belly. "Word is you went down to the pens last night," Carter said, his voice entirely too calm. "Brought feed to that cow I specifically said was being culled." Emily didn't answer. She just stared right into his eyes. "You're disobeying a direct order, girl. I'm the foreman of this ranch. As long as the boss ain't here, my word is the law. Do you understand that?" "I understand," Emily replied. "Then why do you keep doing exactly what I told you not to do?" She took a deep breath. The baby shifted, and she felt a sharp little jab in her side. "Because that cow doesn't need to die, she just needs care." Tyler let out a muffled snort. Kyle shook his head, staring at the dirt. Carter took a step closer, closing the gap between them. "You don't know the first thing about livestock, girl. That cow threw wheat calves 2 seasons in a row. That's a bad bloodline. Care ain't gonna fix it. The problem is in her veins. And I am not about to let an animal like that poison the herd I've been looking after for over 20 years. Emily held her breath. There was something about the way Carter talked about the cow, a hatred that went beyond logic, beyond basic herd management. It was personal. It was as if the animal was a stain he couldn't stand looking at. If Mr. Hayes comes back and finds out you slaughtered an animal that could have been saved, do you really think he's going to be happy about it? Emily heard her own voice ring out, much steadier than she felt. Carter's face turned to stone. Tyler and Kyle exchanged quick glances. Wyatt stopped hammering the fence. Mr. Hayes trusts me to make the right calls out here, Carter said, dragging out every single word. And when he gets back, he'll know I did what had to be done. Now, if you keep defying me, you're going to be let go without a reference. And a pregnant woman with no reference. You know how hard it is to find work like that, don't you? The threat hung in the crisp air like thick smoke. Emily felt its crushing weight settle on her shoulders, but she refused to look away. I understand, she said. Good, now get back to work. And I'd better not catch you anywhere near that cow again. Emily spun around and headed back to the main house. Her legs were trembling slightly, but she kept her stride firm until she slipped through the side door and went straight to her room. She shut the door, sat on the mattress, and stayed there, hands resting on her belly, feeling the baby thrash with an intensity that seemed to mirror her own inner turmoil. That night, sleep wouldn't come. She lay on her back staring at the pitch-black ceiling, listening to the bitter wind rattling the window pane, thinking about Bessie out in the corral all alone, freezing, with no one to care for her. She thought about Carter's threat of being fired without a reference. She thought about the baby due in just 10 weeks. She thought about the father who had vanished without a forwarding address, without a single explanation, leaving her with nothing but a growing belly and a loneliness that chilled her deeper than any winter storm. But then her thoughts shifted. She remembered the way Bessie had rested her snout against her arm in the dead of night. She remembered the animal's eyes, which seemed to understand entirely too much, and she realized that if she folded now, if she accepted the silence and submission everyone demanded of her, she would be teaching her unborn child that the world is right to crush those who have no voice, and she absolutely refused to do that. The next morning, Emily woke up early as usual, but this time she had a plan. She needed to figure out if there was any way to reach Bessie without Carter finding out. She needed to know what his next move was, and she desperately needed an ally, even if that person didn't know they were going to help her yet. During breakfast, she kept a close eye on the ranch hands. Tyler and Kyle were fiercely loyal to Carter. That much was obvious. Wyatt was an enigma. He never spoke, never offered an opinion, just did his job and clocked out. Ben, the youngest hand on the payroll, was the one in charge of opening and shutting the pasture gates. He had a quiet, almost timid demeanor, like a kid who hadn't yet been fully hardened by the rugged life out here. He was the one Emily decided to gamble on. Later that afternoon, as she was finishing hanging laundry on the sideline, she spotted Ben walking alone toward the tool shed. She approached him carefully, clutching her basket of clothespins. Ben. He stopped and turned around. He couldn't have been more than 22, with a lean face and eyes that constantly darted away. Hey, Miss Emily. Do you know where they moved Bessie? Ben hesitated. He glanced around the yard as if checking for eavesdroppers. Carter told us to haul her out to the isolated back pasture. Said she's supposed to stay there until... He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging. Until when? Emily pressed. Ben dropped his voice to a whisper. Until the end of the week. He said he was going to resolve the situation. Emily felt her blood run cold. End of the week. That gave her 3 days. Is there a way to get out to that back pasture? There is, Ben whispered, still keeping his voice low, but I got strict orders not to let a single soul through that gate. Direct orders from Carter. Emily looked right at him. There was something in the young man's eyes that wasn't callousness. It was doubt. It was deep discomfort. Do you think what they're doing to that cow is right? She asked him point blank. Ben fell completely silent. Then he gave the faintest shake of his head. I don't, but I'm not the one running things around here. Nobody runs things all by themselves, Ben. Things only happen because people follow orders. He stared at her for a long time. Then he averted his gaze and walked off toward the shed without another word. But Emily knew she had planted a seed. Now she just had to wait and see if it would take root. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, she woke up again. She bundled up in her coat, grabbed her flashlight, and slipped outside. She walked out to the edge of the yard, where she could see the dirt road winding toward the distant pastures. The moon was buried behind thick clouds, and the darkness was absolute. Suddenly she heard footsteps. She whipped around, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was Mary, the longest-serving housekeeper on the ranch, a woman in her late 50s who had been working there since before Emily was even born. "What are you doing out of bed?" Mary asked in a hushed tone. "I was just going for a walk." Mary looked at her with an expression that was hard to read in the pitch black. A woman 7 months pregnant doesn't go for midnight strolls in the freezing cold. "You're planning to go after that cow, aren't you?" Emily didn't answer. Mary let out a heavy sigh. "Get inside. Right now. Before someone catches you out here." Emily complied. The two women headed back indoors in total silence. Mary led Emily into the empty kitchen and carefully eased the door shut. She lit a single, tiny oil lamp they kept in the cupboard for power outages. The feeble flame cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. "Sit down," Mary said, pointing to a chair at the heavy wooden table. Emily sat. Mary pulled out a chair opposite her and sat down, resting her calloused hands on the tabletop. "I've worked on this ranch for 28 years, Mary began, her voice low and steady. "I've seen a lot of things. I've seen good people get trampled on. I've seen bad folks rise to the top. And I've seen people who tried to do the right thing get completely destroyed for it." Emily stayed quiet, hanging on every word. "You don't know Carter the way I do," Mary continued. "He isn't just a foreman enforcing the rules. He's a man who bends the rules to get exactly what he wants. Mr. Hayes' father trusted him like a brother. And when the old man passed away, Carter sank his roots even deeper around here, because Mr. Hayes spent 3 years away managing a co-op, only visiting every now and then. By the time he officially took over the ranch, Carter's roots were so deep that even the boss couldn't rip them out without making the whole property bleed. But Mr. Hayes is coming back in 2 weeks, Emily said, "once he finds out what's going on." 2 weeks. Mary cut her off, a strange edge to her voice. "Emily, Mr. Hayes is coming back a lot sooner than that." Emily's heart leapt in her chest. "What do you mean?" "I got a message from him late last night. He wrapped up his business out of state faster than he expected. He'll be here in 11 days, and Carter doesn't know a thing about it yet." The silence that settled over them was heavy with implications. Emily slowly processed the news. "So there's still time." "Time for what?" Mary asked, leaning in slightly. "Time for you to save a cow? Time for you to lose your job, your references, and end up homeless with a baby on the way? Emily, I understand why your heart bleeds for it. But you need to understand something. On this ranch, whoever crosses Carter doesn't survive. It doesn't matter if you're doing the right thing. It doesn't matter if you have the moral high ground. He'll destroy you before Mr. Hayes ever sets foot on the property, and by the time the boss gets here, you'll be long gone and completely forgotten." Reeling herself in, "I just stay quiet while he slaughters an animal that has every right to live." Mary stared at her for a very long time. There was something etched into the older woman's face that Emily couldn't quite decipher. Maybe it was sheer grief, or the ghost of an old memory. "I used to be just like you," Mary finally whispered. 15 years ago, we had a similar situation around here. A young ranch hand, a good, honest kid, figured out that Carter was skimming feed and selling it under the table. The boy went straight to Mr. Hayes, who was barely even living on the property back then. You know what happened? Carter flipped the whole story upside down. He made it look like the kid was the one stealing. He planted evidence, brought in fake witnesses. And that boy was fired on the spot, stripped of everything, his reputation left in tatters. 2 months later, word got back to us that he had killed himself. hung himself in an abandoned barn a couple towns over. Emily felt a sudden chill that had absolutely nothing to do with the winter weather. "And you didn't do anything?" she asked, not accusingly, just desperate to understand. "I was terrified," Mary confessed with brutal honesty. "I had 2 little kids to raise all on my own. I needed this job to survive, so I kept my mouth shut, and I've carried that weight every single day since." The silence rushed back in, thicker and darker than before. "I can't stay quiet," Emily said, her voice finding its steel. "If I bow down to this now, I'll be teaching my kid that the world is right to crush the people who have no voice. And I will never teach my child that lesson." Mary closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was a fierce resolve burning in them that hadn't been there before. "Then you're going to need some help. Over the next 2 days, Emily tried every possible angle to sneak out to the isolated pasture where Carter had banished Bessie. But the main gate was constantly guarded. Ben was strictly following orders to block anyone from passing, and even though that look was constantly guarded, Ben was strictly following orders to block anyone from passing, and even though that look of deep discomfort never left the boy's eyes, he wouldn't dare defy the foreman, not yet anyway. Late on the afternoon of the second day, Emily felt her first contraction. It wasn't agonizing. It was a slow, creeping tension that started in her lower back and wrapped around her belly, making her stomach rock hard for a few agonizing seconds before fading away. She was out hanging laundry on the line when it hit, and she had to grip the wooden fence post just to stay on her feet. "You okay?" It was Shannon, walking by with a heavy basket of vegetables. "I'm fine," Emily gasped, taking a deep breath. "Just a cramp." Shannon looked at her, her face a tangled mess of worry and something that looked an awful lot like guilt. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, then snapped it shut and kept walking without a word. That night, Emily tossed and turned. The contractions crept back 2 more times, always mild, always far apart, but just enough to terrify her. She lay perfectly still, with her hand cradling her stomach, feeling the baby squirm. And for the very first time, she wondered if Mary was right. Maybe she was gambling too much. Maybe she just had to accept that she couldn't save everyone, that she couldn't fight the whole damn world. But then the sun rose on the 3rd day, and everything turned upside down. Emily was in the kitchen, helping Martha get breakfast going, when she spotted it out the window. Carter had swapped the padlock on the gate to the back pasture, and Ben was nowhere in sight. The young hand had been reassigned to a completely different sector, miles from the holding pens. In his place stood Tyler, Carter's most fiercely loyal lapdog, the guy who laughed at cruel orders and never questioned a thing. It was checkmate. Carter had severed the only route Emily knew, and he had stationed his most trusted man to guarantee nobody got through. Emily dropped the peeling knife and bolted from the kitchen without a word of explanation. She marched across the yard straight for the gate. Tyler saw her coming and immediately planted himself in front of the iron bars, crossing his thick arms. "Don't even think about it," he sneered, before she could even open her mouth. "I just want to see if the cow is still breathing. Foreman's orders, nobody goes through, especially not you." Emily stood frozen in the dirt, gripping the freezing iron latch of the gate, feeling her baby roll inside her. The sheer, overwhelming helplessness hit her like a physical blow, as biting as the wind whipping her face. She trudged back to the main house, every step feeling 10 times heavier than the last. She walked into her room, shut the door, and sank onto the bed. She sat there for God knows how long, just staring blankly at the wall, feeling something shatter deep inside her chest that had absolutely nothing to do with labor pains. That was when she heard a soft rap at her door. She opened it. It was Wyatt. The oldest ranch hand was standing in the hallway, his weathered hat in his hands, nervously tapping it against his thigh. He glanced over both shoulders before speaking, like a man terrified of being watched. There's an old deer trail through the woods, he murmured, his voice barely a rasp. Way out back. The old-timers used to use it to check the herd in the dead of night. Carter doesn't know it's there. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. Where? A dried-up creek bed. He said it all without ever looking her in the eye, acting as casually as if they were chatting about the weather. "Why are you helping me?" Emily asked softly. Wyatt stood perfectly silent for a long moment. Then he settled his hat back on his head. "Because I stayed quiet once when I shouldn't have," and he walked away without waiting for a reply. Emily bided her time until mid-afternoon, waiting for the crew to get bogged down in chores and for the yard to finally empty out. She bundled up in a heavy coat, tied her hair back, and slipped out the side door facing the back edge of the property. The hidden trail Wyatt had described started just past the furthest tractor shed, swallowed up by a tangle of dead brush. Emily plunged into the woods carefully, tracking the landmarks she had burned into her memory. The fallen oak was about 100 yards in, the massive boulder another 200 yards to the left. The dried-up creek cut a diagonal slash through the timber. The ground was rugged, littered with low-hanging branches that clawed at her coat and thick roots that demanded absolute focus with every step. Her belly felt like a lead weight, turning every single motion into a brutal negotiation with her own body. Emily tripped once, crashing down hard onto her knees, catching herself with her bare hands on the freezing soil. She stayed down for a few agonizing seconds, gasping for air, feeling the baby kick wildly as if protesting the grueling trek. She dragged herself back up. She kept pushing. A hike that should have taken 20 minutes dragged on for nearly an hour. When she finally broke through the final stretch of timber and emerged on the other side, the isolated pasture stretched out before her. And there she saw Bessie. The cow was standing up. She was horribly frail, practically a walking skeleton with ribs jutting against her hide, but she was on her feet. When she recognized Emily, she ambled slowly in her direction, every single step looking like it required a monumental effort. Emily felt hot tears welling up, but she bit her lip and forced them back down. There was no time for crying. She swung her backpack around and pulled out the special feed she had mixed. She poured it onto the frosted grass. Bessie started chewing slowly, her wet snout brushing against the palm of Emily's hand every few seconds, in a gesture that felt heartbreakingly like gratitude. That was when Emily heard the crunch of boots. She whipped her head around. It was Tyler, standing on the far side of the fence line, staring dead at her with a look that stripped away any shadow of a doubt. He had seen everything, and he was going straight to Carter. Emily practically sprinted back to the main house, her heart threatening to hammer its way right out of her chest. She knew Tyler had already rushed off to rat her out. She knew the explosion was coming. But when she finally burst into the main yard, she was met with something entirely unexpected. Dead silence. Nobody was waiting to ambush her. Nobody yelled her name. Nobody said a word. She slipped through the side door, beelined for her room, and sat rigidly on the edge of her mattress, just waiting for the axe to fall. The baby was tossing and turning with an aggressive energy that mirrored her own sheer panic. She rubbed her belly, desperately trying to soothe the child, trying to soothe herself. 2 agonizing hours later, heavy boots thundered down the hall. A sharp, violent knock rattled her door. "Emily, get out here." It was Carter's bark. She pulled the door open. The foreman was looming in the hallway, with Tyler, Kyle, and Wyatt lined up right behind him. 3 witnesses. That wasn't an accident. Carter never did anything by accident. "You went out to the back pasture," Carter growled. "It wasn't a question. You defied a direct order. You trespassed into a restricted zone. Tyler caught you red-handed." Emily didn't say a single word. She just stared straight into his cold eyes. "I warned you exactly what would happen if you kept pushing this." Carter went on, his voice dropping to a low, deadly purr of a man savoring his total victory. "You're fired. Right here. Right now. No references. And if Mr. Hayes starts asking questions when he gets back, I'll tell him exactly how it went down, that you completely disregarded the chain of command, brazenly ignored repeated orders, and recklessly endangered your own pregnancy out of sheer stubbornness." Tyler stood there with his arms crossed, a sickeningly smug grin plastered across his face. Kyle kept his eyes glued to the floorboards, looking sick to his stomach. Wyatt stood like a statue, his face utterly blank. Suddenly, Emily felt a vicious stabbing pain rip through her abdomen. It was light years worse than the cramps from before. She had to grab the doorframe just to keep from collapsing to her knees. "You all right?" Kyle blurted out, taking an involuntary step forward. "I'm fine," Emily gritted out, panting heavily. But she wasn't. Another contraction crashed over her, hitting so hard she had to squeeze her eyes shut to endure the agony. "She's going into labor," Wyatt announced, his gravelly voice finally shattering his eternal silence. "She's 7 months pregnant, and she spent the whole damn afternoon bushwhacking through dense timber," Carter snapped, utterly devoid of an ounce of pity. "That is her problem, not mine. Now get back in that room, pack your trash, and get off my ranch before sundown." Emily stared at him. Then she looked at Tyler, who cowardly averted his gaze. She looked at Kyle, who was still boring holes into the floorboards. She looked at Wyatt, who met her eyes with an expression that looked tragically like grief. And then she retreated into her room. She sank onto the bed and just sat there, clutching her belly, riding out the relentless waves of contractions. They weren't steady yet, but they were violently real. And she was terrified. That's when Mary barged into the room without even knocking. "Are you bleeding?" the older woman demanded, cutting right to the chase. "No." "Are you having contractions?" "I am, but they're not close together." Mary marched over, pressed a firm hand against Emily's stomach and waited. When the next wave hit, she felt the agonizing tightening of the muscles and her brow furrowed into a deep scowl. "You need to rest. Right now. Lie down. Carter just told me to pack up and leave the ranch." "Carter doesn't run me," Mary spat, with a sudden ferocious fire that Emily had never seen in her before. "Lie down. I'm getting water and a cold rag." Emily did as she was told. She eased herself back against the pillows, feeling every inch of her body scream in protest. Mary hurried back with a basin of lukewarm water and a clean washcloth, draped the damp rag across Emily's forehead, and pulled up a chair right next to the bed. "No cow on God's green earth is worth losing this baby over," Mary whispered, her voice finally softening. "It's not about the cow," Emily rasped, staring finally softening. "It's not about the cow," Emily rasped, staring blankly up at the ceiling. "It's because if I bow down to this right now, I'm teaching my kid that the world is perfectly justified in crushing the people who don't have a voice." Mary fell silent. Emily watched a single heavy tear slip down the older woman's weathered cheek. "You remind me so much of him," Mary choked out softly. "That boy I told you about, the one who blew the whistle on Carter and ended up—" She couldn't even finish the sentence. Emily turned her head to look at her. "I'm going to write to Mr. Hayes," Mary announced, out of absolutely nowhere. "Tonight. I'm going to tell him there's something rotten out here that he needs to see with his own 2 eyes the second he gets back. What if Carter finds out? Then he finds out. I'm sick to death of keeping my mouth shut." That night, while Emily tossed in agony through rolling waves of contractions, Mary drafted the message. She kept it brief, blunt, and free of outright accusations, just enough raw urgency to make the boss hit the gas pedal. The reply pinged back the very next morning. He would be there in 2 days, not 3, not a week, 2 days, and he explicitly told her not to breathe a word to Carter. When Emily finally opened her eyes the next morning, she realized the contractions had stopped. Her body felt like it had been run over by a truck, but the baby was okay. She could feel the steady, rhythmic kicks that put her terrified mind at ease. She dragged herself out of bed and hobbled into the kitchen. Martha was standing at the stove, frying up breakfast. When she spotted Emily, she dropped her spatula. "I thought you'd packed up and left." "I'm still here. Carter is going to go absolutely ballistic." "I know." Martha stared at her for a long, heavy minute. Then she poured a steaming mug of black coffee and slid it across the counter toward Emily. "Drink up. You're going to need your strength." It was a tiny gesture, but it meant the absolute world. Later that morning, Carter drove his truck out to the back pasture personally. He didn't take an entourage this time. He went entirely alone. And when he rolled back into the yard, there was a look in his eyes that made Emily's blood run colder than the winter freeze. It was the dead-eyed stare of a man who had finally made up his mind. Sleep was utterly impossible that night. Emily sat bolt upright in bed, cradling her belly, endlessly tallying up everything she had tried, everything she had lost, and everything she was still about to lose. The doctor in the next town over had sworn up and down last week that her baby was perfectly healthy. But she was exhausted in a way that went so much deeper than bone and muscle. It was the soul-crushing fatigue of someone who has been screaming into the void without knowing if anyone was listening on the other side. The dawn of the following day broke with a completely different energy. There was a frantic, nervous buzz humming across the ranch. Hands were walking faster, frantic glances were being exchanged. Hushed whispers died out the second anyone got too close. Emily slipped out of her room and headed to the kitchen. Shannon was in there rattling silverware as she tried to set the breakfast table with violently trembling hands. "What is going on?" Emily asked. "The boss," Shannon squeaked out, refusing to look up. "Mr. Hayes!" He pulled in before sunrise, didn't warn a soul. Emily's heart slammed into overdrive. She abandoned the kitchen and rushed to the window overlooking the main driveway. Mr. Hayes's white, heavy-duty pickup was parked dead center in front of the main house. He was standing by the main equipment barn, locked in a quiet conversation with Mary. Carter was marching toward them with brisk, heavy strides, oozing the arrogant confidence of a man who had no idea the ground was about to fall out from under him. Mr. Hayes greeted Carter with a curt nod. The two men spoke for a few tense minutes. Then the boss demanded something that made Carter's brow twitch violently. He wanted to see the herd, the entire herd, including every single head out in the isolation pastures. Emily watched Carter freeze for a fraction of a second. Then the foreman gave a stiff nod and started walking toward the pens, with Mr. Hayes falling into step right beside him. Tyler came sprinting out of the office, clutching a stack of manila folders. Paperwork, veterinary logs. Carter immediately started talking, waving his hands around, his voice booming with fake authority. Mr. Hayes just listened in dead silence, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When they finally reached the back pasture and laid eyes on Bessie, Mr. Hayes stopped in his tracks. He stood there staring for an agonizingly long time. He demanded the cow's complete medical history. He demanded the feeding logs for the past 3 weeks. Tyler scrambled to hand over the paperwork with a panicked haste that gave everything away. Carter started rambling before he was even asked. He claimed the cow was already scheduled for culling, that she was a massive drain on resources, that she was dead weight dragging the herd down. He meticulously crafted every single word to sound highly technical, ruthlessly efficient, and entirely unavoidable. Mr. Hayes listened to the whole speech. Then he casually reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Emily was watching the entire showdown from the kitchen window, her heart pounding so aggressively it felt like war drums in her ears. She watched Mr. Hayes slowly unfold the paper. She watched all the color completely drain from Carter's face. Half an hour later, every single employee on the payroll was summoned to the main barn. Emily was the last one to walk through the doors. She lingered near the back wall, bundled up in her ratty wool coat, her belly massive, her face thoroughly exhausted from weeks of freezing cold and relentless terror. Mr. Hayes was standing dead center in the barn, clutching Bessie's official registry certificate. He started reading it out loud. That broken-down cow was the direct offspring of a grand champion bull imported years ago. Her pedigree was flawlessly documented. In elite auction circles, animals carrying those exact genetics commanded prices that would take any man standing in that barn decades of hard labor to save up. And Carter knew it. He had been lying systematically. He had been drastically undervaluing the ranch's premium livestock to quietly sell them off to outside buyers he was taking massive kickbacks from. The silence in the barn was so absolute it was deafening. Carter opened his mouth to defend himself. His voice cracked into a pathetic wheeze.